G'day, I'm Rowan Mackey and welcome to Individuate, the podcast where we use the vehicle of starting our own podcast to try and get the best out of ourselves in the service of others. Today's episode of the podcast, I've called Building Branding, because that's what we'll be talking about today. But in many ways, we're not talking about branding in the way that many people think of branding. Dare I say, a lot of marketers think of branding as a bit of a superficial concept, in my opinion. A quick Google of the word branding comes up with a whole bunch of definitions related to it being a tool for differentiation, as if it's simply a way to tell the difference between different entities. But I think that's potentially a bit of a surface layer definition. If we look at it on a superficial level, then in many ways, that is what branding is. But it also misses a whole lot else of what branding is. I'd almost argue that being differentiated is a result of good branding, rather than inherent to branding in itself. Many brands are undifferentiated, but all good brands can clearly communicate their difference. With the tools and technology available these days, even many branding agencies and internet services churn out cookie-cutter branding concepts for vastly different businesses. If we think of things in purely practical terms, the number of brands in the world vastly outnumbers the number of brand designers. Whether they be through an agency or freelance, there's a bottleneck when it comes to the people who design brands. That bottleneck becomes greater if you're looking for something on the cheaper side. In a traditional situation, you might have multiple brands all being designed by the same person in a short space of time. But how is someone properly going to tap into the essence of what each brand is if they only have such a short space of time? So it seems to me that we have to tap into the deeper elements of branding if we actually want to differentiate ourselves. Even if that's for no other purpose than providing a clear, concise brief to someone who's going to be able to implement your vision. The other thing about branding that I think is important to highlight is if we think back to episode 9, when we were talking about creativity, and Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi did the experiment where he followed the artists beyond university. Well, one of the major findings of that study was that the artists who lived as almost the stereotypical creative were the ones who did much worse. The artists who succeeded weren't the reclusive, mysterious, wildly abstract thinkers that pop culture would seem to suggest they'd be. But it was the ones who knew how to sell themselves that were successful. They were the ones who knew how to collaborate with others and co-opt other artists into their vision. What strikes me about this finding is the similarity with podcasts. It's a figure that I come back to a lot, but 51% of podcasts have less than 6 episodes. I think part of the reason for that is that when people start a podcast, they're either doing it for a creative reason or a commercial reason, but they don't quite have a balance. For example, they have this great podcast idea that they can't wait to pursue, but then they get a few episodes in and realize that it's unsustainable to be putting in so much work for something that they don't know how to make any money off. Then there's the other group, the commercially driven group, who might be sitting in a team meeting and someone in the office decides it would be a good idea to start a podcast. But they may have only heard about someone else getting a particular benefit from their podcast. Or they may want to stand out as being an innovative business, but they don't actually have much of an idea about what their podcast will be about in a purely creative sense. With podcasts, as with the artists in Csikszentmihalyi's experiment, we need to find a way of balancing both the creative and the commercial imperatives. And it seems to me that branding is one way of how we do that. If we can use our podcast to build a personal brand, then we can leverage that brand in a commercial sense to make our podcast viable. Another aspect of today's podcast that I want to point out is that whilst we're talking about branding, I think the deeper elements of branding that we'll be speaking about have a much broader application than they're typically given credit for. Some of the material from today's podcast came from Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why: How Great Leaders Inspire Everyone to Take Action. I must admit, when I picked up the book for the first time, I didn't expect to get a lesson in branding, but Simon Sinek understands that it's about a deeper element than just surface level differentiation. So I'm excited to explore some of that material with you a bit later on. Before we get there though, I want to tell you about the most influential person in the history of sports entertainment. George Wagner was born in Seawood, Nebraska in 1915. It was a tough place at a tough time, as America was gripped by depression. His father was a house painter who struggled to find work, and his mother was bedridden with a form of paralysis. It was a tough childhood for young George, who had lived in 3 different American states by the age of 1, as his family moved around as his father looked for work. The Wagners settled in Texas. However, this didn't spell the end of the unrest, as this was around the time of the Mexican Revolution and the bandit general Pancho Villa was completing his infamous US border raids. George would speak in later life about growing up dirt poor. He remembered how he spent most of his childhood down by the water or taking care of his sick mother. By the time he was 14 years of age, both of George's parents had died and he had dropped out of school. As an orphan boy, not yet 15 years of age, facing such tough circumstances alone, things looked bleak. But it was at that point that fortune started to turn for young George. He was taken in by the James family, who had 2 young boys around his age. George and the James boys, along with 2 other friends, would spend all their time wrestling and fighting whoever challenged them. The group became known as the Harrisburg Five, and each of these 5 boys went on to become professional wrestlers. George Wagner started his career on the carnival circuit in 1932 under his own name. At 5'9" and a relatively small 215 pounds, the early part of his career never gave him much success. He wasn't able to intimidate his opponents like the other wrestlers. Wrestling wasn't the sports entertainment that we know it to be today, but it could better be described as athletic hand-to-hand combat. Most of the moves involved grappling or basic throwing, and although it wasn't the out-and-out competition of boxing, it certainly wasn't the scripted circus that we see today. After nearly a decade wrestling, now the early 1940s, it seemed that George's wrestling career was going to come to an unremarkable end. That was, however, until he came across an article in Vanity magazine that gave him an idea. The magazine article was about the wrestler Lord Patrick Lansdowne, who would enter the wrestling ring wearing a velvet robe and accompanied by 2 valets. This kind of showmanship appealed to George, who saw the opportunity to bring more entertainment to professional wrestling, and so he decided to dress that way himself. George had recognised that without some form of gimmick, his career would likely peter out. Although it's commonplace in wrestling today, up to this point, wrestlers didn't have gimmicks or characters and presented themselves usually as a generic athlete, a farmer, or a foreigner. The other thing was that nearly all the wrestlers were seen as hero characters. Apart from the villainised foreigner, there wasn't the hero and villain type pantomime that characterises wrestling today. George recognised that if he played the role of the hated villain, it could add longevity to his career by adding something to the spectacle, even if he wasn't going to be celebrated himself. This is a decision that took incredible courage and made him a very rich man. Influenced by Lord Patrick Lansdowne, he'd enter the arena wearing opulent robes to the tune of Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance. He curled his hair in prominent golden locks, which were held together by golden pins. He famously dubbed these pins Georgie pins, and before each fight, he'd ceremonially take the golden pins out of his hair and toss them dramatically to women in the crowd. He was accompanied to the ring by a manservant and a model who was also his wife, and they would spray Chanel perfume around the ring, creating an amount of pomp and ceremony for his arrival. This whole act would enrage the audience whenever he entered the arena, but George loved it and called the crowd peasants, as if energised by the loud chorus of boos. As legend goes, one night, as he was carrying out his dramatic act, he heard a woman in the crowd call him gorgeous, and so he ran with it. And at that point, the wrestling icon, and indeed the branding icon, Gorgeous George, was born. Known as the human orchid, George took the character further than anyone had ever taken a character before, creating the first real gimmick for a wrestler that we'd recognise today. As I said, wrestling was in its early days, and so this type of behaviour was absolutely unheard of. I'll put a video up on the podcast page for today at www.individuate.com.au because it's worth checking out. But Gorgeous George's character was in many ways the antithesis of what it was to be the American man in the post-World War II era. He allowed the all-American type wrestler to be the hero, and he played the villain. In antagonising so much of the public through his appearance and carry-on, Gorgeous George was the first heel character in wrestling. In wrestling, the heel is the villain type character, who's supposed to provoke the crowd and galvanise support behind the hero. But before Gorgeous George, there wasn't anywhere near this much drama in wrestling. And George's loud shouts of self-adulation and declarations of his own beauty were something completely unheard of in post-World War II era America. Another thing that happened around that time that worked hugely in George's favour was the advent of television. In the early days of television, there was hardly anything on at all. And to say that Gorgeous George was an early draw card is an understatement. By the early 1950s, wrestling matches featuring Gorgeous George were only surpassed in ratings by the legendary comedian Milton Berle. It has been said of Gorgeous George that he can be credited with establishing network television as a viable entertainment. It's hard to understate the impact that Gorgeous George had on the world today. But it wasn't just George himself that had the impact, but it was also those who he directly inspired. The godfather of soul, James Brown, said in his 2005 memoir, I Feel Good, that he used parts of George's Human Orchid act to create the James Brown you see on stage. In his memoir, Chronicles Volume 1, Bob Dylan also says that he was inspired for years to come by a single encounter with Gorgeous George in Hibbing, Minnesota. But unarguably, George's greatest act of influence, and admittedly the reason that he's on this podcast, came one day at a radio station when he met a young boxer known as the Louisville Lip, Cassius Clay. Although he was already known for his ability to talk, hence the nickname, a young Muhammad Ali was blown away by Gorgeous George's trash talk one day at a Las Vegas radio station. If I lose to classy Freddie Blassie, I'll crawl across the ring and cut my hair off. But that's not going to happen because I'm the greatest wrestler in the world, George bellowed through the radio waves. When he attended the match, Ali later recalled, I saw 15,000 people coming to see this man get beat, and his talking did it. I said, this is a good idea. In the locker room after the fight, the veteran entertainer told the young boxer, a lot of people will pay to see someone shut your mouth. So keep on bragging, keep on sassing, and always be outrageous. According to Muhammad Ali himself, his showman style directly came from Gorgeous George. I got it from seeing Gorgeous George wrestle in Las Vegas, Ali told the Associated Press in an interview in 1969. I saw his aides spraying deodorant in the opponent's corner to contain the smell. I also saw 13,000 full seats. I talked with Gorgeous for 5 minutes after the match and started being a big mouth and a bragger. He told me people would come to see me get beat, others would come to see me win. I'd get them coming and going. Needless to say, the rest is history. I don't care what sport you follow today, the influence of Gorgeous George is there. Even in the sports that are more competition-based than wrestling, this idea of the heel is something that we see in just about every sport that's being commercialised today, even if it's just the media who creates that character. I can think of examples in basketball, NFL, tennis, ice hockey, rugby league, rugby union, AFL, even now in golf with Patrick Reed. Just about every time you hear of a bad boy figure or a villain character, or even the way some rivalries between teams are talked up these days. Anytime in sport, there's a sense of a hero versus villain. That's partly due to Gorgeous George. The fact that he influenced Muhammad Ali is almost enough to warrant an episode on him in itself. But Gorgeous George really is in many ways the godfather of sports entertainment because of the way he was able to brand himself. And so that's what we're talking about today. Because regardless of what you do, if we can harness the power of good branding, like Gorgeous George, we can go from average to great. Again, I'm not saying it's the easiest thing to do, but if we can take our own advice of weeks previous and can somehow deconstruct what good branding is, ideally with the help of a good teacher, then we can go some way to being able to recreate it ourselves. Luckily in this case, we do have a teacher who was able to deconstruct the best branding, Simon Sinek. I'll put a link up to his TED Talk at the podcast page for today, individuate.com.au, because it's brilliant. But Sinek recognises that most businesses do branding backwards. They communicate in the opposite way to the way that great leaders communicate. And if we can tap into the way that leaders, such as Martin Luther King, communicated, then we can vastly improve the accessibility of our brand. The way Sinek demonstrates this is through his concept that he calls the Golden Circle. The Golden Circle is a graphic of 3 concentric circles, On the outermost circle is what we do. In the middle circle, how we do it. And in the inner circle, why we do it. As Sinek says, most companies communicate from the outside of the circle in. Nearly everyone or every business knows what they do, whether they sell products or offer services or fulfill a role within an organisation doing those things. Everyone has a pretty good sense of this. Some organisations and individuals know how they do it. How do they stand out from the competition? And what are their unique set of strengths that they bring to the table? This is sometimes being called a USP or a unique selling proposition. Sinek uses the example of two teachers in two adjacent classrooms. They might be teaching the same material. Their what is the same, but their how could be vastly different. In terms of branding, this is about as far as traditional branding goes, as I'll demonstrate shortly. Very few organisations and individuals, according to Sinek, know why they do what they do. What is the deeper motivation for existing, and what inspires that brand, whether it be a business or an individual, to want to serve people? After all, business is simply solving problems for people. The why is what motivates us to want to solve this problem. Some businesses and people don't ever get to the why stage or even the how stage, but if we can recognise that for ourselves, we can co-opt people into our vision who also recognise the value in our deeper mission. As Sinek says, when those three elements, what, how and why, are aligned, it gives us a filter through which to make decisions. It provides a foundation for innovation and for building trust. When all these three things are in balance, others will say with absolute clarity and certainty, we know who you are, we know what you stand for. That last line there, I think that's such an important bit because it's the difference between traditional branding and these deeper elements of branding that we're speaking about today. What do you stand for? When I was completing my digital marketing certificate, we would get guest speakers come in who are practitioners and they'd answer questions and give a bit of a lesson on their particular area of interest in marketing. And one of the people who came in to speak was the former marketing manager for Bunnings Warehouse. For my international listeners, Bunnings Warehouse is a huge Home Depot-like store in Australia, and for a long time, their tagline was, "If you find a lower price, we'll beat it by 10%. Obviously, that was a competitive advantage, but as I'm sure you can see, it only acknowledges the what we do and how we do it in Simon Sinek's Golden Circle. For Bunnings, they'd have ads all about their available products and then their tagline, "If you find a lower price, we'll beat it by 10%. The advertisements with the products were the what, and the beating it by 10% was the how. That's an example of a company that only communicated from the outside in. But as the marketing manager was telling us, this promise of 10% cheaper wasn't as successful as you'd think for a company of that size. They recognised they needed to add another layer to their branding, and so they tapped into their deeper why as a business. They realised that Bunnings wasn't just about going to get cheap materials. It was the entire experience of going to Bunnings that set them apart. When you go to Bunnings, you're greeted by warm, friendly staff who are incredibly knowledgeable, and many of whom would use Bunnings regularly for their own hobbies. Traditionally, there'd be people there selling sausages for charity. To its customers, Bunnings wasn't just a shop. It was a hallowed emporium where everyone could go together and equally enjoy the outing. It was where backyard projects were dreamed up and where the weekend spent bonding over DIY projects started. So what did Bunnings do to integrate this idea with their branding? They had the genius idea of spotlighting their staff in their commercials. Ever since they made this discovery, Bunnings ads have featured their actual staff who talk about their actual experience working at Bunnings. They created a real sense in their ads that the staff loved their job. And outside of the advertising space, they gave their staff equity within the Bunnings company. Now the job satisfaction of Bunnings employees was greatly improved. No other huge corporation featured so many of their seemingly lower level employees in their advertising campaigns. And by being paid Bunnings stock, they were financially invested in the company, which over time translated into an emotional investment. This emotional investment from the employees meant that as a company, Bunnings staff were more ready to help their customers than their competitors. They were happier coming into work because to them, work represented something more than just a shop. It was a touch point for so many DIY hobbyists. And for many of them, who are DIY hobbyists themselves, they could impart their wisdom and share their knowledge and experience with people who genuinely appreciated it. All Bunnings did to do this was to put their actual employees in their ads. And now their tagline is lowest prices are just the beginning. So if we too can tap into our why, then there will be so much more to our brand than just what we do and how we do it. Something we see so often. Another example of this, and this is the one that Cynic himself uses, is with Apple computers. As has been pointed out by many people, Steve Jobs included, Apple absolutely nailed their branding compared to other computer companies. That's because other computer companies communicated from the outside of the golden circle in. They would start with what, and then how, and then that would be it. For example, most computer companies would say, "We make great computers. They're beautifully designed, easy to use, user-friendly. Please buy one." Apple, though, recognized that they needed to start with the why, and then go to the how, and then the what. Apple's branding was more like, everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in doing things differently. We do that by making technology. They're beautifully designed products that are easy to use, user-friendly. We just happen to make computers. Do you want one? What this demonstrates is a concept that Cynic points out and is central to the idea of branding. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. If you look at car ads these days, they recognise this idea. Very few car ads involve many details about the car itself. They're all based around the idea of enabling freedom or allowing enough space in the back so the kids will be perpetually happy. They're all based on these deeper, more emotional notions than just this car looks nice and it won't break down. As Cynic points out, the reason for this is based on the way our brain works. We're biologically wired to affiliate with brands in this way. Again, like on previous episodes, I'm not a neuroscientist, so you'll have to forgive my simplified explanation. But due to the way our brains have evolved over time, different areas of the brain are responsible for different activities. Before modern humans, our brains were much less developed, and the part of our brain that we retain from that period of our evolution is called the limbic brain. The limbic brain is responsible for our deeper emotions like trust and loyalty. It's responsible for all human behaviour, as well as decision making, but it has no capacity for language. Since modern humans came along, we have evolved what's called a neocortex, literally the Latin for new brain. This part of our brain is responsible for all our rational thought, our analytical thought, and our capacity for language. The interesting thing about this is that the part of the brain responsible for trust and emotions has no capacity for language. This is why it can be so hard to articulate our feelings sometimes, even if we feel particularly strongly about something. Or why at other times you get a bit of a gut feeling without being able to rationalise exactly why you're uncertain or apprehensive about something. One central element of branding is the idea that you're building unconscious trust with someone. And based on the model of the brain, it's very hard to do that through rationality alone. In fact, Simon Sinek knew this when he was putting together the golden circle, and so the circle itself is based on the cross-section of the brain. The neocortex, or rational part of the brain, corresponds to the what on the golden circle. The limbic brain, responsible for trust and loyalty, corresponds with the how and why elements of the golden circle. If this is the part of the brain responsible for decision making, then we're wasting our time trying to rationalize people into affiliating with our brand. We have to help them connect on a deeper level, an emotional level. And how do we do this? It's through connecting with the why that we do something. As Cynic puts it, you want to attract people who believe what you believe. What you do is the proof of what you believe. So how can we implement this for our branding? It's all well and good to talk about these abstract concepts, but how does it play out in a practical sense? Well, if we start with identifying our deeper why, what are the emotions that we want to elicit? What are our deeper values? These ideas are going to influence the style of our design. Apple's modus operandi was about making computers elegant to look at and easy to use. If you look at their logo, all their marketing materials, their advertising, it's all designed in a way to convey these themes. Their use of blank white space meant that overall it was largely uncluttered, and this gave it an easiness compared to other advertising which felt more like it was being shoved in your face. So, what design features will enhance the delivery of our deeper message? Whether they be colours, fonts, a logo, or other aspects of style, we want them to communicate our deeper messages. Then, once we have our style that's based on our deeper thinking about our brand, we've selected the colours, fonts, and logo that intensifies our messaging. That in turn influences other material that we make. All of our assets and other pieces of content should be designed to corroborate the deeper elements and messages behind our brand. Then this in turn influences our more direct communication, how we present in person, in emails, in meetings. We should still be trying to convey the deeper elements of our brand so that there's an alignment and consistency in the messages our brand is communicating. I'll point out here that it's interesting to note just how much communication is non-verbal. And so this is an entire can of worms into just exactly how to do this at a practical level in terms of graphic design and color theory and typography, all that sort of stuff. So I won't get too deep into it today, but at least having some idea of the theory behind all of this is incredibly helpful. Now, before finishing up with branding today, there's a few points that I want to make. Firstly, similar to something that we've spoken about on the podcast before, we have to recognize that our branding actually isn't for us. It's for our audience. On a practical level, branding is about building unconscious trust and familiarity, and people are more likely to trust and affiliate with those who have shared values. We can't do that by simply conveying the what and how in Simon Sinek's Golden Circle. We have to acknowledge why we do something in order to convey what those values are. The other thing that happens when we connect with our why is that we associate with others who have an aligned mission. We're able to attract others who are also working towards something and improve our brand through association. But we can't do that as much unless we're able to convey what we're working towards on a deeper level. Another point I want to make super quickly is not something I really want to get too deep into today because it's something we'll explore on future podcasts. But one thing that strikes me about some of the principles of branding is that there's a bit of an overlap with Jung's idea of the persona. Both a brand and a persona are collections of curated communication designed to build unconscious trust. Like with branding, it seems to me that the persona can either allude to deeper elements of a personality or it can present as more surface level. For example, the people who are able to tap into their deeper why are often more positively infectious to be around. I must admit, I haven't fully thought this through as much as I'd like, so I'll leave it there for today as a bit of a teaser. But this is something I'm keen to unpack after next week's podcast, which I'll explain in a moment. Finally, the last point that I want to make about branding is about authenticity. And I think there's a lesson that we can learn from Gorgeous George. There's always been something that stuck out to me about Gorgeous George, and that's just how much he loved wrestling. George discovered a love of wrestling just after his parents had both died and with his friends. It seems to me that the Harrisburg Five would have given him a sense of belonging. But for someone who seemingly loved wrestling so much, someone for who wrestling would have been an escape from the harsh realities of life and a chance to express himself more than he ever would have been able to, George chose to be the villain. Some could argue that without Gorgeous George's influence, wrestling, and indeed sport more generally, would be viewed through a much more positive lens. But this is not a theory that I particularly subscribe to. And the reason for this, in my opinion, could have been found in Gorgeous George's Golden Circle. Before thinking about things in terms of the Golden Circle, you could look at Gorgeous George's brand and go, okay, what does he do? He's a wrestler. How did he differentiate himself? He decided to be the negative character, to galvanise all the positive characters against him and create so much negative publicity that it grew the sport. But that's not how I see Gorgeous George. This is a man who put himself through over 3,000 professional wrestling matches. There had to have been a deeper motivation than just being a villain to make money. And I really wonder if, for George, wrestling really did represent something deeper than just an athletic pursuit. For him, he would have been able to essentially gain a family through wrestling. It gave him an escape when America was recovering from a world war and in the midst of a depression. When he had the idea to become the villain character, I think he recognised the benefit that it could give the sport on a deeper level. In an America that was recovering from another world war, he recognised how wrestling could be an escape for people beyond its current ability to do that. Before his Gorgeous George character, it was as if wrestling hadn't fully reached its full public potential in his own eyes. And if becoming the villain and playing up for the crowd in a negative sense turned people against him, well, at least they were feeling as passionately about the sport of wrestling as he did. Now, I recognise that I've used the word there a couple of times, but Gorgeous George technically wasn't a villain. He was a heel. And I consider there to be a significant difference between a villain and a heel. That is, the heel still brings something to the sport through their perceived negativity. The true villain's negativity detracts from the sport. Lance Armstrong is a villain. Sun Yang is a villain. Bernard Tomic is a villain. Their blatant disrespect towards their sport doesn't add anything. And in my opinion, I don't have any interest watching them compete. They just detract from the pursuit of the hero. But the heel can definitely bring something. Even if you hate them, they can get you so fired up to watch your preferred player or team succeed that it can be absolutely crushing if they don't. So for me, the heel is someone whose deeper why is overall positive. Even through being perceived as negative or anti-establishment, they're still trying to contribute something to the sport more generally. You may disagree with their particular way of doing things, but the true heel doesn't turn you off the sport completely. So, with branding, if you can connect your deeper why, even if people don't particularly agree with the way that you do things, you can still be recognised to be contributing to something larger. It seems to me that most of the real villains, certainly in sport anyway, don't have a deeper why that connects with anything outside themselves. And to me, a villain is not a good way for a brand to be categorised. So that's all we've got for the podcast today. I've already started working on next week's podcast, which I'm super excited to bring you, because we'll be looking at one of my favourite people to ever exist, Muhammad Ali. Like we did with Leonardo da Vinci and creativity, we'll use Muhammad Ali's story to keep looking into some of the deeper elements of branding, as well as starting to look a bit more into the persona, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. I almost feel I couldn't speak about individuation without looking at Muhammad Ali, so I'm really looking forward to doing that next week. As I said earlier in the podcast, you can access today's episode page or any of the other episode pages at www.individuate.com.au. Just click on the tile for today's episode. Also, I haven't mentioned it in a few weeks on the podcast, but please feel free to reach out to me, rowan@easygoingdigital.com.au. I'd love to hear from you which parts of the podcast are resonating most and where you're up to in your own creative journey. So thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope to do it again on the next episode of Individuate.